Now that we've been through action potentials, we can talk a little bit more about what this action potential does as it travels down the length of a neuron. So when we talk about traveling the length of a neuron, it's important to recognize that there are two different types of axons that a nerve impulse can travel along. Number one, there's a myelinated, and number two, unmyelinated. So when we're talking about the speed of a nerve impulse, it's really important to recognize that the larger the myelination of a nerve fiber, or the thicker that nerve fiber is, the faster it's going to be. Okay, and this comes into our debate with myelination versus unmyelinated nerve fibers. So when we're talking about unmyelinated fibers, what we are addressing is the fact that depolarization, okay, so that change to the membrane potential of one area of the membrane, is what causes the sodium channels to open, but it opens in the adjacent area. So maybe I'll get my red pen to underline that there. This is what causes the action potential to then spread to the next section. And then as there is a large change to the membrane or sodium channel concentration or sodium concentration of the next part of the neuron, it causes the adjacent area to then start another action potential, and this flows down the length of the axon. Okay. Now, the nerve impulse itself gradually moves along that membrane. So if we were to look at that very quickly, and we see an axon here, the red in this diagram represents the action potential actually occurring, and so we can see that the action potential starts here, progresses to here, and finally ends up here. We can see that following that action potential is that brief refractory period as the membrane is still in a period of hyperpolarization perhaps. However, after that has restored and reached that resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts, another action potential may be triggered. Now, we can see here that there is this change. Maybe I won't use my red pen here. We'll switch that, for a yellow pen. As we can see that the membrane potential has flipped due to the rapid influx of sodium into the cell, creating the inside of the cell membrane more positive relative to the outside. This then causes a little bit of change in the next portion of the membrane. And so if I highlight the next portion of the membrane, maybe in orange here, and in orange here, and in orange here, this is what is gradually being influenced to open some sodium channels, leading to slow depolarization, before eventually the threshold at negative 55 millivolts is reached, and then a rapid depolarization occurs. So when we have a look at transmission along myelinated nerve fibers instead now, so another kind, the nerve fiber, as we discussed in our first lesson on neurons in a myelinated fiber, is insulated. That was the word we used in that lesson. And this insulation occurs thanks to the myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath can do one of two things with this insulation. Number one, it protects the neuron. And the second thing that we mentioned is that it also speeds up the rate of conduction. How does this occur? Let's talk about it now. So, if ions can't flow in from the extracellular to intracellular fluid because the myelin sheath is wrapping around it, it means that an action potential can't form. So instead, what the action potential does is it jumps from one node of Ranvier to the next node of Ranvier. Now we can see the nodes of Ranvier represented on this diagram here. I'll highlight them in orange. And these nodes of Ranvier are the only portion of the membrane which is exposed to both the intracellular and extracellular fluid. Okay? And when we're talking about this jumping from node to node form of connection, it has a name known as saltatory conduction. And these nerve fibers, or these nerve impulses, I should say, travel significantly faster than those on an unmyelinated fiber. So, for instance, an unmyelinated fiber can travel up to about 2 meters per second, as opposed to a myelinated fiber, which travels about 70 times faster at about 140 meters per second. So how does this work? Well, similar idea, but this time because these Schwann cells, I'll get my yellow highlighter here, because these Schwann cells block the extracellular and intracellular fluid, the nerve impulse itself and the action potential can jump from node to node. And that's what we're gradually seeing in this image here, is that when the action potential causes that influx of sodium, gradually changes the extracellular concentration of sodium, leading to slow depolarization in the next available part of the axon. So when we look at a nerve impulse, what we can see, well, firstly, this up top is a neuron at rest. We can tell because of the negative charge inside the cell and positive charge outside of the cell. And then when we look at the nerve impulse itself, we can see, really importantly, this area where all of a sudden the cell has flipped. So sodium has flooded into the cell, depolarization has occurred, and this is where the impulse is occurring at that point in time. So some final key things to note. When it comes to the strength of the individual nerve stimulus, the nerve impulse itself is always the same strength. However, some stimuluses, or some stimuli, I should say, can feel stronger than others. And there's two main reasons for this. Number one, more nerve fibers are stimulated at a given time. Or number two, there are more nerve impulses in a given time period. So here's what we mean by these two things. In one versus in two. In one, we can have more nerve fibers. So each of these lines represents an axon. So each of these representing more nerve fibers being stimulated based on a given stimulus, leading to a larger response than just a single stimulus. Secondly, we can have one nerve fiber. However, there could be an action potential occurring here, and once the refractory period has occurred, we can have multiple action potentials running down this neuron in a given time, compared to only one in this neuron down the bottom left-hand corner. So when it comes to the strength of stimuli, again, it can feel stronger. However, it's not because it is, in fact, a stronger stimulus. It's just that either, number one, more nerve fibers have been stimulated, or number two, more nerve impulses in a given time period.